Okay, I'm going to talk about my approach to setting out an Xbracing pattern. So we've got the soundboard, the rosette is inlaid, the soundboard has been thicknessed and the sound hole's been cut out. And I've trimmed it within about 5mm of the outline. So first thing I have to do is put a centre line on it. Sometimes this can be quite difficult to see. I've actually got a centre line on the outside, so if that's the case you can transfer it over from the outside. If not, you've got to try and look for it. So that's the centre line. The next step is to draw on the template. This is my template, and because I've got a cutaway, I've got a separate little template for the cutaway half of the guitar. Otherwise, it's symmetrical up to the waist, so I can use this. Now, I usually put the edge of the sound hole. Most of my acoustics are 20 frets, and for the sake of visual propriety, you might call it, I put the edge of the sound hole at the 21st fret position. So it's quite easy to calculate what the distance would be from the body join, if you know what fret that's at, usually the 14th or the 12th, not in this case, to the edge of the sound hole. And in this case, I've got 85.8 mil to the edge of the sound hole. I think for the other side I calculated this from the centre of the sound hole, so you would take that figure and you would add on the radius of the sound hole. So I've got a point here which tells me where the top of the template is. If you're doing this on a more conventional 14 fret or 12 fret guitar, that dimension is usually to the 12th or 14th fret, and you've got to take into account the curvature of the body shape. My templates have a little nick at the waist, and I make a pencil mark there. Then when I'm fitting the sides, and I've bent the sides and I'm fitting them, that gives me a reference point that I can keep referring back to. There's my little waist nick. And you need to make sure this is a good strong line, because if you're using the Spanish method of building on a solera, not a mould, this is the line that will determine where the sides go. So it needs to be clear. And that's the outline. The next thing I need to do is draw on the bridge, because everything is determined by the sound hole in the bridge position. And I know the bridge is, let me see, 289 mil is the scale length from the body joint, and I'm going to add 4 mil to that because that will be the compensation. So 4 mil onto 289 is 293. Of course, these dimensions will be different for you depending what you're following. But what I'm trying to show is here is the logic of setting out an Xbracing rather than just measuring dimensions off a plan. There's an absolute logic to this. Now I'm just looking at the bridge and measuring the distance from the front of the bridge to the middle of the saddle slot, and this saddle slot's slightly off. So I actually want about 8mm forward of this point. This point is where the middle of the saddle slot will be. My 8mm gives me the front of the bridge, because I'm going to draw the bridge onto here. So first of all, take that front of the bridge point and square it across. And these little plastic squares are really good for this sort of thing. So now I can put the bridge template on, put the centre line on the centre line. The bridge is extremely important in the location of the bridge is very important in when you're setting out a bracing pattern, because this is the heaviest brace on the soundboard. Don't forget that it is a brace, it's on the other side of the soundboard, but the way this interacts with the X-brace and everything is very important. So you need to know exactly where your bridge is and what size and shape it is at this point, not later. Now we have a transverse brace, big fat brace above the sound hole, and I'm going to make that only 3mm away from the edge of the sound hole, because this is a structural member. All this stuff is not only structural, but it has to resonate. This is just a big cut-off bar that stabilises the neck and doesn't have any significant resonant function. So that is the bottom of that. Now when I draw braces, I always draw both sides of the brace, so you've got a reference for when you're actually gluing them on. Now the next thing to establish is the X-brace itself. Traditionally most steel string bridges are about 150mm long, 6 inches. So what I'm going to do is measure 75 from the centre line, half of that distance, just onto the back of the bridge. If this was a traditional bridge with squared ends, the rule of thumb is that the centre line of the X-brace goes through the back corner of the bridge. Because this has got the flared ends, and they're flared to be, the idea is they're parallel with the X-brace, so you're not wasting any extra wood on the other side. So this is, the X-brace passes through this point, which is 75 from the centre line on the back of the bridge. And this is the centre line of the X, remember. So that you can treat that as a pivot point, and it could be like that, it could be like this. But what we want to do is get close to the sound hole, because we're going to kind of build a frame, pentagonal frame around the sound hole. That's a weak point in the top, so it needs reinforcing. And we can't go any further up than that because of this cross brace, because we want to go into the side. We don't want to stop the brace here. So and remember, there's another 3.5mm on this side of the centre line. So we can't go right up to there with the centre line of the brace. It can come to about here, which is reasonably close to the sound hole. So I'm going to draw that on as the centre line. And then on the other side we want exactly the same. It's going to be symmetrical. So it passes through this point, it wants to cross the centre line in the same place, and it should hit the side at a distance of 22 down from the transverse bar, which is there. So those 3 points should all be in a straight line. And that's it. So that is the other arm of the X-brace. And then we can put the width of those on. The X-brace in this case is 7mm wide, so I can mark 3.5 each side. Same down here. the same here. Now from a structural point of view, this X is carrying the string loads from the bridge towards the neck. The next thing, also I should mention this is the stiffest part of the soundboard, this triangle here. So you can see the bridge is an integral part of this triangle, which is stiffening the soundboard against the pull of the strings in this direction. Now, to stiffen this area further, we need a bridge plate on the back, on the inside. The bridge plate is bigger than the bridge footprint, and I usually use a figure of 6mm in front and behind the bridge. So that's 6 in front, and with the square, you can take that across up to the X-brace. At the back, you could have a straight one, but to cut down on the weight, I tend to follow the bridge shape. So I merely move the bridge template down to the 6mm mark and do a second line here. So this is your bridge plate from there to there. That stiffens the bridge. It also, the grain is going in this direction, perpendicular to the soundboard grain, which is also true of the bridge. So in effect you're creating a kind of ply sandwich. With plywood you always want the grain direction of the two outside pieces in the same direction, and that's why plywood always has an odd number of plies. So this is a stabilising plate. It also prevents, it's a hardwood plate, it prevents the string bore ends from digging into the soundboard, which they would do. Now, what we have now is these three pockets, this triangle here, this triangle here, this triangle here, and we also need some stabilising and reinforcing around the sound hole. So there are two braces, stiffening braces either side of the sound hole, and again remember we're trying to stiffen and stabilise this area, so we want to be close to the edge of the sound hole. But on the other hand, something that, after doing this very close for a while, I realised quite a lot of acoustic pickups have a volume control, which is a little thumb wheel control that goes in the sound hole and actually sticks to the soundboard on the inside, just about here. And that needs a bit of space. If you're too close to the edge, you haven't got that space. So nowadays I pull this back a bit from the edge, and I generally use the top of the soundboard centre line as my kind of radiating point, and I'll draw that one there. And this brace is going to be 6mm wide, so I can use that as the edge of the brace rather than the centre. And I'm actually drawing this across the X-brace and the transverse brace. And the reason for that is, for the sake of stability, I like to notch this brace under this one and this one. Now when I put the neck on, I've got a neck extension coming right up to this bar, which kind of stabilises the top. If you weren't doing that and you had a traditional block up here, you could extend these two braces and notch them into the block, which would help to stabilise this and stop. The neck wants to twist at this point because of the string tension. So that's something you have to guard against. Now I've got to do the same on the other side, so if I simply measure outwards to where that crosses the line, 41, I can draw it on the other side. Again, use the same point to radiate from, and draw that on. Six millimeters thick, wide should I say. Okay, now traditionally we would have 2 finger braces here, 2 here, and 2 lower face braces here. What I like to do is put, this is the base side. Traditionally this would be slightly looser than this side. I don't think it really matters whether you do the looseness on the bass or the treble, but I think the key factor here is asymmetry. If you've got asymmetry in the soundboard, then you've got 2 different resonances going on. And the aim, once we shape all this bracing, is to get as many different resonances going on as possible. If you just had a single strong resonance, the note of that resonance would be really powerful, and the other notes would be, it would be like a spike, a peak. We don't want that. We don't want to favour one note. We want a diversity of resonances. And for that reason, I usually put 3 braces on this side and 2 braces on this side. And the rule of thumb that I use is I divide the area. I calculate what this area is, and I divide the area into 4 if there's 3 braces, 4 equal pockets. 3 equal pockets on this side and 3 equal pockets here. So this is going to have a bar there and a bar there. This is going to have 1, 2, 3. This is going to have 1, 2. And the way I calculate the area, which is very simplistic and is kind of approximate, but it's as close as it needs to be, is to divide the whole area into squares. And I do that just by, it doesn't matter what size the squares are as long as they're all the same. So I just use the ruler itself as a template to make parallel lines. So each time I'm putting the ruler on the previous line and tracing along the edge of it. They're not even square, these squares. The angle is greater than 90 degrees, but again it doesn't matter for these purposes. Of course, if you're doing the drawing on AutoCAD or a CAD system, you could use the digital drawing to calculate this, but this is a nice simple earthy way of doing it. And it's a technique I learnt when I was at junior school, when I was about 10 years old. Who'd have thunk it would be so useful. It's just an estimating technique, not an absolute accurate technique. So those are the squares, and then what you do, you count every whole square, and if the square is more than half, like this one, you count it, and if it's less than half, you don't count it. So I wouldn't count these, and I wouldn't count that one. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 37, 38. So there's about 38 squares there. You'll notice I'm working on this old piece of cartridge paper. And that is simply because I've done my rosette, I've got a nice clean outside to the soundboard, and I really don't want to scratch that or dent it, and so this acts like a cushion against the bench. Anyway, I've got my 38 squares and I want 4 equal parts. So 38 divided by 4 is 9.5, I believe. I know the width of each bar is going to take a little bit of that out. So I want just over 9 in each section. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 10. 2 strips is 10. So I'm going to take, again, it's kind of, if I had 5 of those together, and they're a fifth of the width, that's equivalent to 1 square. So I'm going to put my first brace here, and that brace, when I've got 4 braces, I make them when I've got 3 braces, I make each one 4 millimeters wide. When I've got 2 braces, I make each one 6 millimeters wide, and therefore the actual footprint on both is the same in terms of the area, because 3 4s are 12, 2 6s are 12. So this one's going to be 4 mil wide. Now the other thing I do when I'm doing braces, the X braces run into the lining. All the other braces, I stop short of the lining. I want about 10 mil space to the lining. Now the side plus the lining is about nearly 10 millimeters wide. So I use a number of 20 mil away from the edge for the end of the brace. So that's the first one. Now we want another 9. We've got a little bit more there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's probably half a square on there. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 and a half. So this time I can come in a little bit further with the brace. Let's see, about here I think. This one. This is not, as you can see, this is not an absolute measured thing. It's to get me in the right sort of ballpark. And these braces, these finger braces, I'll parallel with this brace. They're not quite square to this brace. I don't know if you can see, but if I put that on the X brace, these are running off by about 5.5 degrees off the square. And now we've got, it's probably one from those pieces, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we want 3 out of those 5, so just over halfway. That's the third brace, around here somewhere. And I'm measuring square off the edge to get for the 20 mil rather than in this direction, because that's the distance from the edge. And then we should have about 9 squares left. So there's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, that's good. I've got my 3 finger braces on the treble side. Well, the filming of the previous section stopped a little prematurely, and I've actually glued some of the elements on now. I've glued on these 3 bars which we set out, the 3 finger braces on the treble side, and I've glued on the bridge plate. This is a piece of maple, this is Douglas fir. So I've drawn out the other sections, so I just want to explain how I did that. And I've used the same logic as we used here. If you remember, we counted 38 squares in this area. So rather than drawing the squares here, I can count, this time I'm dividing into 3 sections So I want approximately 12 squares in each section, because the two braces take care of the other 2 squares, more or less. So if I count 12 squares, that's 10, and 12 is about halfway down there. I can measure that distance, which includes 12 squares, and copy that distance onto this side. 12 more squares in between, 12 squares here. And then I've done exactly the same here. Now the difference this time is that these bars aren't really in a regular position, and I'll show you. I've actually derived the first, this is the kind of traditional Martin way of doing it, with 2 diagonal bars, except in this case I don't do them parallel, because I want an equal area in each of these 3 sections. So I start with a line just clipping the edge of the bridge, and I kind of pivot that until I've got my, there's actually 45 squares here, so I'm looking at 15, 15, 15. So I pivot this until I've got 15 in this area, which gives me this line, and then I'm using about a 20mm gap and pivoting this one to get 15 in this area, 15 left here. And you'll notice in between here there's a little diamond patch, and I'm thinking of the centre line here. What I don't want to happen when the guitar's complete is that the centre line should open up at all. So we reinforce that. It's a bit like the reinforcing you would put on a back seam on a guitar. It's just a precaution really, because you don't want this seam opening after the guitar's completed. It's much easier to reinforce against it at this stage. So if you look at the centre line here, we've got the neck, there's a bar, there's the hole, there's a short section up to the crossing, a short section up to the bridge plate, short section up to this lower face brace, and this is really the longest unsupported section of centre join, and that's the reason we're reinforcing that with a little patch. So that will be a 10mm by 10mm spruce patch with the grain going in the opposite direction, and after it's glued it'll be about 2.5mm thick. After it's glued and dried, I can then shave with a chisel into a pyramid shape. And of course here we've got the end block, 20mm thick. And I use 20mm on a classical guitar. You might take this down to about 10. The reason I'm keeping this at 20 is because we may want to install either an end pin or an end pin jack for a pickup, and having 20mm of solid wood gives you good support for that. If you've got a strap button on here, you're taking quite a bit of the weight of the guitar on that strap button, so it needs a good solid anchorage point, which is the end block here. And that's about it.